Hey everyone, and welcome back to Amaranth Bay. Today, we're going to carry on with our westward expansion of downtown, focusing on a cool project which is going to help us deal with the steep grades on this side of the city. So far, I've been having a lot of fun reviving the city's streetcar system, so I wanted to continue that theme by creating a unique form of transportation that's inspired by a relic from Duluth's history, and you might be familiar with it. That is the 7th Avenue West Incline Railway. The real thing opened in 1891 and closed in 1939, and by the way, you can still see the path it took in modern-day Duluth. But I wanted our version to have been in more or less continuous operation for the last century and a quarter. Since we're working with the same terrain as Duluth, I wanted it to run largely the same path and distance, so that's half a mile in about this spot, which happens to be about 100 in-game units. So I'm going to draw a 100-unit guideline here and just extend it up a little bit further to where the hill begins to flatten out up here. I'm also going to extend the street grid to use mostly just as a measuring stick more than anything, so that I know where to put the top station down in relation to the street grid. We're not necessarily going to fill all of this in-between area with roads and development, but that's something we're going to deal with later on. To build this, I'm going to use this fantastic pack of funicular assets, which I'm going to link down in the description if you want to build your own. Technically, this system that we're building is an incline railway and not a funicular, since a funicular is defined by two counterbalancing cars, so when one goes down, the other one goes up, because they're connected by a single wire. Whereas in an incline railway, it's more open, and the cars can move independently of each other. But it's really a meaningless difference in-game, so I might just end up using the terms interchangeably. The railway itself is quite simple. I have a single segment of station track at each end, and then the standard track running in between, since I just want a point-to-point system, just like the original in Duluth. Interestingly, I do have to have these station buildings placed in order to have vehicles spawn, but they don't actually need to be physically connected to the network. That might seem kind of weird, but it's going to come in really helpful later on when I decide to make some changes to the network. For now, just think of this version as a proof of concept. So get these vehicles on the track going up and down, which I would call a pretty decent start, but there are some issues with this network in its current form, all of which we're going to have to address at some point in the video. First, while the grade we're working with is pretty steep, it's not as steep as what these vehicles were designed for. So they look a little bit angled, but you can really only tell when you look at it directly from the side, so I'm not too worried about it. And I do really like the historic look of the vehicles overall, which I think kind of mirrors the heritage streetcar that we have running on Main Street. Second, and this is how the game just tends to work, the pillars often don't line up perfectly in relation to the roads. So I'm going to remove all of them with BOB and then replace them with the same props in IMT so that I can have more control over the spacing. Finally, there's the issue of the stations. For whatever reason at the time, I felt restricted to have the buildings clipped into the spot where the station track is, even though they're not physically connected to the network, which ends up becoming really limiting as to what sorts of buildings I can use to make our custom station. So what I have at first are these more historic buildings that have been pared back a little bit, or maybe it's new construction built in an older style. And then we also have this more modern building at the front underneath where the track emerges from the building. I'm painfully aware that this does not look particularly good at the moment. So at the end of the video, I'm going to come back and completely redo the station to be open air and more reminiscent of the original in Duluth, and just better looking overall. But at the time, I really didn't want to get stuck in the weeds focusing on this one small part of the project. So we're going to move on for now and work on building up the downtown around the station. The downtown street grid is a bit broken up here, and I'm thinking that's a fairly recent change to the road network. Just beyond the station, kind of up and to the left, is where the Main Street meets up with the large avenue, and in fact that intersection is also going to serve as a major entrance and exit to the freeway in a future episode. So since there's going to be a lot of new traffic passing through here, I'm thinking that at some point they would have wanted to remove a cross street that was so close to a major intersection. And so they've replaced that stretch of cross street with a little park attached to the station, and it's also right next to the streetcar stop, so it kind of just makes it a bit more of an attraction in its own right and not just merely a transit station. There's a little parking lot for the station building over on the other side. I'm thinking that the station building itself would also double as the downtown visitors center, since the Incline Railway would also serve as a tourist attraction as much, or maybe more than, as a practical transit option. So as much as I'd like all of our tourists to take our heritage streetcar to ride the Incline Railway, they also have the option of driving here and parking in this parking lot as well. This part of Main Street happens to be where I want to transition away from the brick surface to standard asphalt. I'm going to achieve that by adding a filler beneath the segment where the streetcar stop is and match it to the 4-lane segment of the road you can see over to the right. That's going to result in what I think is a nice, clean transition. I've talked in previous episodes about how I want the development around this avenue to be more modern than much of the downtown. But I did want to make one exception here, just so I can use this awesome angled building that I've been keeping in my back pocket for months now. It happens to be the perfect shape, so I pretty much had to put it down here. Then the rest of the block just needs a couple more buildings and some details to cover up the steep terrain. Last episode, I described how I plan to have the development along Main Street either be historical buildings or newer ones built in a similar style, at least for the most part. And today we're going to execute that plan by finishing off all of Main Street, at least on this end of downtown. I'm going to use mostly 1 to 2 story brick buildings to create a nice, cohesive look, but I'm going to throw in a couple more glamorous ones here and there as well to keep it interesting and serve as sort of like visual anchors for the rest of the more homogeneous development. So you can kind of tell where you are in the city despite most of the buildings looking more or less the same. Some of you may have noticed these 2 buildings hanging out in the background of previous videos, and now it's finally time to detail them up and make them fit into the downtown. The style of development is going to be a lot different here than what we've been doing previously for the most part, with each hotel building and its accompanying parking lot taking up an entire block. There are a few reasons I want to transition to this kind of development for this part of the downtown. First off, the particular assets I'm using were designed for it, so they wouldn't necessarily work that well as wall-to-wall buildings. You could probably make it work alright, but I think it's just easier to do it this way. Next, I think it also kind of mirrors the more spread-out style of the government complex from last episode on the other side of Main Street, so you kind of have these more sparse developments on either end of the denser shops along Main Street, and overall, I think that balance is going to help sell the transition from dense to less dense. Finally, I'm thinking that the area around Union Station would have been part of the city's relatively recent push to develop more tourism infrastructure. So that's going to bring in more of the big money developers who are going to be willing to use expensive land for something like a parking lot if it's going to increase the appeal of their projects in the long run. Anyway, the details for the first hotel are fairly straightforward. Since it's a lot easier to build a parking lot on a flat surface than on a sloped one, as you might have noticed last episode, I decided to have the lot at the halfway point between the elevations of the two roads that bound it, and then I'm just going to use a bunch of retaining walls to cover up the gaps. Other than that, I also wanted to spruce up the base of the building a little bit by adding some brick surfaces near the entrances, both at the front and over on the sides as well, and some nice planters to make it a little bit more inviting. Oh, and a door, because the asset didn't have one here. And then, of course, we have to add some trees in between the retaining walls and the roads, which is going to become a running theme over this episode and the next one. For the second hotel, I'm going to take inspiration from this guy in Duluth. I'm going to move it over to the side to make room for a depressingly big parking lot, and also give it a little extension that reaches over to the upper street over here, since I did feel like it needed some sort of rectangular base structure rather than just leaving this standalone tower, which might look kind of weird. This thing looks pretty silly at the moment, but I think once we detail it up, it'll look a little bit better. I didn't want to leave the parking lot as is, just kind of rectangular and boring, so we're going to make some customizations, hopefully to have it feel a bit more custom-made for this environment. There's a little curved spot for the pull-through here. There's some planters and retaining walls, just like with the other one. And then there's going to be a little pedestrian area leading from the sidewalk over to the entrance, so you'd have a slightly lower chance of being hit by a car if you wanted to walk over from the train station instead of catching a taxi or bus. Now we're going to go back to this area and clean it up a little bit. First, using another copy of this generic building, isolating a single wall panel so that I can cover up the floating door up on the second level, and then replacing the built-in door at ground level with a new one because it was sort of sunken into the ground and just looked terrible. I feel like this kind of build can get pretty repetitive with like parking lots, benches, trees, parking lots, benches, trees over and over again. So we're going to finish it up for today and move on to a different kind of development to bridge the gap between Main Street and the hotel district. I wanted to use these two half blocks between Main Street and the hotels to kind of split the difference. So we have some more modern car-focused developments at a smaller scale than the hotels were, but also a few older buildings that are remaining, and hopefully that kind of contrast is going to help flesh out the transition between these two areas that I've been talking about. First off, we have the downtown branch of the public library. Even though I had promised myself I'd never do another ivy wall after the absolute pain that was the brewery, I caved and decided to put one here because I needed some sort of nice looking retaining wall. And then also because of the slope, the foundation of the building is exposed over on this front face. So I'm going to go a bit more easy on myself and skip the ivy wall and instead use a tidy concrete planter with these cute little trees in it. As I said before, the more modern developments in this stretch are more car-friendly, so I'm going to put a pre-made parking lot out back here because, honestly, I was tired of making them by hand. Although, of course, it does need a retaining wall and a few other details, but I do kind of like the resulting contrast where we have all this dark new asphalt butting right up against these old brick shops. Next, for the other half block, there's a public parking garage, which I think we do need here because there isn't one on the western side of downtown yet, so just for realism, we're going to do that. There's a sad little row of older shops in between this one and the next building we're going to put down, which is this cool Art Deco mid-rise. I've been feeling like the city needs some more Art Deco buildings, and I have been sneaking some smaller ones in here and there, but this was pretty much the last spot in the downtown where I thought this one might work and be able to look fairly realistic, so it's going to go down here. So with that section of the downtown finished up, I decided that it was time to move on up the hill and work on the area around the upper station. Unfortunately, this is where things started to go off the rails. I had originally wanted to build something along the lines of this building that once stood at the top of the Incline Railway, which was called the Beacon Hill Pavilion. So I detailed up this fancy building attached to the station, but it ended up just feeling really out of place, especially when you look at it from a distance. It almost kind of looms over the city like an acropolis or something like that, which is kind of cool, but I don't think a single rail station really warrants that kind of grandeur in the city. So I thought I might get a better sense of what to put here instead by filling in all this space in between the downtown and the upper station. In Duluth, there's a scattering of houses around this location, but I wanted to carry on the kind of more tightly clustered pre-war homes like we placed back in episode 11. There were a couple of problems with this though. First, this area is extremely steep, and even with these houses, which were designed to be slope friendly, a lot of them are left floating and just generally not fitting into the environment that well. Second, having this big lobe of houses just kind of dangling off the end of downtown didn't feel right at all. So I think the overall issue I was dealing with here is that I just got too excited to work on the upper half of the railway without kind of earning it first by building out from the downtown and giving everything some context. The good news with all of this, at least I hope it's good news, given that you've made it this far in the video, is that the solution to this is just to do a bunch more building. Well, first we have to do some deleting, actually. I'm just going to get rid of the upper portion of this neighborhood, which I've called Station Hill for obvious reasons. It might be that I just end up remaking it later on in the series once we work our way farther up the hill, or I might turn it into like a cliff-filled park to motivate the lack of development. I don't know. But the point of getting rid of all of this is just to trim back the development and make it look more reasonable given the current extent of the downtown. The next step after that is to take some of these angled blocks and fill them in with development. In Duluth, there seems to be a mix of modern and historic apartments, alongside the usual single-family homes, of course, as well. But I didn't really have any historic buildings at this point in time in my collection that fit the bill, so I decided to go for modern apartments for the most part. Some of these buildings, like these modern row houses, are just upzoned and redeveloped land where there maybe used to be single-family homes, while other ones are built where the grid's been disrupted, like this skinny apartment building at the end of an old alley. I think having this kind of greater flexibility with how I can orient the buildings and what types of buildings I can use makes it a lot easier to deal with the steep terrain, because I can angle them with the slope instead of against it, or use multi-story apartments to hide the slope altogether, just clipping them into the terrain. Of course, there's also the age-old solution of covering all the ugly bits up with trees. The idea wasn't to go for uber realism here. I'm mostly just trying to get some believable background noise, if you will, so we can start having the downtown not feel so isolated and have some nice context behind it. Of course, another bonus to all of this is the influx of new population. Since we built a lot of stores and offices and services over the last 12 episodes, but not a lot of houses. I think we go from about 9,000 people at the start of the video and end with about 11,000, which is a pretty good boost, I think. And I think this area, while it is definitely far from perfect, ended up looking a lot better than it did before. Now, in the spirit of making the downtown look more complete and less isolated, we're going to fill in these last few blocks between the government complex that we made last episode and the avenue that we made 2 episodes ago. Starting off with some bigger historic homes that no one in the city could bring themselves to demolish and replace with modern apartments. next up we have this block, which is going to be more similar to the angled blocks on the other side of the avenue that we built with the condos. So we have apartments nearer to the intersections where the grid has been disrupted, just like I've been saying over and over again, and some lingering single-family homes in between. Then there's this smaller block just down the street where I guess I could put down like an apartment tower or something, but I just wanted to keep it more low-key and add in a small grove of trees, which maybe they grew there to cut down on traffic noise or something like that. There's also a fairly nondescript apartment complex over here, just a few buildings, a big parking lot, and enough trees to keep the residents from going crazy. Hopefully. So originally, this was going to be the end of the episode. I even had moved on and recorded a whole nother video, but the incline railway Acropolis kept bothering me. So I decided to come back later on with a fresh set of eyes and give the network another go, with a particular focus on the stations and how the cars interact with them. My first goal is to improve the slope of the tracks, so I lowered the first node of the bottom station track to make it in line with the rest of the track's slope, then drag the node almost all the way to the next road over. I'm also going to change the main length of track to the bi-directional version, and this eliminates the need for cars to switch tracks at the station, which is important because, like I said before, I want the new station to be open air. I'm going to do the same thing with the station track up at the top. Then with the new start and end points and slopes, I'm going to use Move It to make sure the entire thing has a consistent slope. Although I do need to raise the whole thing up just a touch down here so it can cross Main Street at a reasonable length. Luckily, this doesn't end up causing any problems later on. To make sure that all the cars can spawn, I'm going to just clip a random funicular station into the nearby parking garage that we placed before. And like I mentioned, the station doesn't actually have to be connected to the track, so this works just fine. If you're going to be using the bidirectional tracks, you have to have a separate line for each side. So I'm going to add a new one and then delete and replace the old one because it just doesn't seem to work with this new setup. So that way we have an east side and a west side and they operate independently. So with the new version up and running just fine, we need to build the new station buildings. I wanted to make something more in line with the original in Duluth, which was really just more of a gate than anything else. All the boarding and lighting is done out in the open air, which I'm sure is really fun during the winter. I'm going to use this nice Rochester train station asset and unfortunately completely destroy it in PO, squishing it down and lopping off pieces here and there until it fits into this tiny area that we have. If you'll remember back to when I was blabbering about the downtown tourist office, I did want to maintain that idea here, despite having gotten rid of the beautiful old brick buildings. So in their place, we get this more modern office, which I'm once again destroying with PO in order to squeeze it down into this niche. Finally, I just wanted some basic kind of industrial detailing over on the side of the station, which is just, for employee access and maintenance access. And, since people are going to be boarding this during the winter, I figured I'd at least be nice enough to put a little awning up above the station itself. To finish off the episode, we're just going to take this station and paste it up at the top of the hill. We're going to adjust all this later, I assume, when we get up to this part of the city, but for now I just wanted something functional there. And that is it for the incline railway build. It was a bit of a convoluted path to get here, but I hope that you enjoyed it, and I can't wait to see you on the next one.